The Origins of the American Revolution, Part 3. This is the third of 4 lectures on the origins of the American Revolution. We left off in Part 2 with the British Parliament in 1765 passing the Stamp Act, which received an immediate reaction from the American colonists. The colonial reaction was swift and sure, but not everyone was involved. Revolutionary and founding father John Adams once put it this way, that during this time period the American colonists broke into 3 groups. A third were in favor of some kind of reaction or even revolution. A third remained loyal to the British, they were called loyalists, and a third simply didn't care. The events were too far away to affect them personally, or they simply just didn't give a damn. But among the third that wanted some form of reaction, it was the elite in particular who defined the reaction. The elite were the merchants, the lawyers, journalists, and clergy. And their reaction was against British arrogance and for liberty and freedom from oppression. The American colonists who were so loyal and so devoted to the British Empire, a previously rather passive people, the elite in particular started to react angrily and openly. With the Stamp Act as catalyst, the colonial elite organized a sophisticated resistance movement which brought business to a standstill. There were mobs in New York City that roamed the streets, destroying government papers and buildings. There was similar violence in Boston and farther south in Charleston, South Carolina, that nullified the Stamp Act by force. In 1766, the British Parliament angrily repealed the Stamp Act before its actual starting date, but they replaced it with something called the Declaratory Act, stating that the British Parliament was sovereign over everything related to the American colonists. The colonists were mollified. They believed that the British Parliament had backed down. But other critics and other historians have viewed the Declaratory Act as something actually more ominous, more powerful, that could control virtually every aspect of American colonist life. But a result of the British Parliament repealing the Stamp Act was an uneasy peace returned. The Parliament went even further and reduced the sugar tax again. And Americans paid this tax because the tax was less expensive than the costs involved in paying for smuggled, illicit sugar. But these events had detonated new attitudes among Americans. For the resistors, for the elite in particular, no longer was the British Empire looked upon as benevolent, a kindly mother, but as arrogant and willful and oppressive. But Great Britain and its Parliament was too blinded by its old attitudes, or too far away to react to these new realities. Resentment smoldered, waiting to burst into flame at a later date, and it wasn't long before that later date arrived. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed, and the Townshend Acts, a whole series of laws, placed tariffs, or import fees, on glass and paper and paint and other imported items that were desirable to the American colonial consumer. And most important among these items was tea. The Townshend Acts also established a new royal bureaucracy established to collect the duties. It was called the Customs Commission. The Townshend Acts established new admiralty courts to settle disputes. These were courts in which juries would not be used. Those in the resistance movement were outraged. The effect of these laws would be to place colonial Americans under centralized controls that never before existed. Britain had not learned its lesson from the Stamp Act response. The sleeping protest movement awoke. There were boycotts, protest petitions, there were nighttime raids that happened. And more importantly than all of that, there was a psychological discovery that also took place. The American colonists learned that they were different from the English. They had different life experiences, different attitudes. And as the controversies and arguments raged, the 13 very different colonies, which actually had very little to do with each other, awakened to a crucial new fact, that they shared a common enemy, which was the British Parliament, that they had a sense of common identity, that they were Americans, not British, and they had a common purpose, which was to gain respect and perhaps independence from the British Empire. This was the turning point on the road to the American Revolution. The historian Robert Kelly put it this way, quote, "Few things are more important or more familiar in history than this process, the driving together of formerly disunited peoples to form a community with a shared identity when they discover that they have a common enemy. A shared sense of the enemy is the most powerful single force that creates and sustains ethnic groups, religious movements, political parties, nations, and revolutions." And so the stage was set. For the colonial resistance movement, there was psychological unity, there was moral outrage, they were being hit in the pocketbook by unfair taxes, and the British Parliament was treating them like children. It all led by 1768 to the beginning of the climax of the events that would lead to the American Revolution, to a policy of coercion by the British government and physical, violent, revolutionary response by the American colonists. And that is what we'll look at in Part 4 of this lecture on the origins of the American Revolution.